The happiness agenda, I remember the last real Christmas. Not the ones after. Those weren't Christmas. They were compliance drills dressed up in tinsel. I mean the last one where the air smelled cold, and the sky went dark at 4 in the afternoon, and my nan put too much brandy in the pudding on purpose. That was the year before the signal. Before they flipped the switch on whatever it was they buried under every major city, and the world went soft and quiet and wrong in a way that took most people years to name. I was 14 then. I'm 22 now. That's 8 years of the happiness agenda, and I've been angry for every single one of them. That's the thing they never accounted for. The ones who couldn't be switched off. You want to know what the signal actually does, I'll tell you, though I'm no scientist and I've never seen the machinery. What I know is what I felt, or more precisely, what I stopped feeling. It started subtle, a kind of smoothing, like someone had taken sandpaper to the inside of your chest and filed down all the jagged bits. You woke up in the morning and your first thought wasn't dread or hunger or the low-grade fury that is, I'd argue, the birthright of every working-class kid who's ever looked at the world and understood it clearly. Your first thought was nothing much, a pleasant nothing, the kind of nothing that wears a smile. The military government, they called themselves the Restoration Authority, which should tell you everything you need to know about them. They announced it as a public health initiative. Stress-related illness had been destroying the nation for decades, they said. Civil unrest was a symptom of collective psychological injury. The signal was a treatment, a frequency broadcast from infrastructure already in place, a gentle neurochemical nudge toward baseline calm. They said it was temporary. They said a lot of things. What the signal actually did was cut the wire between what you knew and what you felt. You could look at a bread line stretching around the block in the December heat because, yes, by then Christmas was hot, genuinely, oppressively hot. The seasons had buckled and nobody was allowed to be upset about that either. And you could register it as a fact without it touching you, without it making you want to tear something down. You knew things were wrong. You just couldn't summon the electricity to care. Most people called it peace. I called it amputation. I was one of the ones the signal didn't take. Not fully. I've thought about why, whether it's genetic or psychological, or whether I was just born with too much static in my system for any broadcast to quiet it. Whatever the reason, the anger stayed. Not the hot flailing kind. The cold, clear-eyed kind. The kind that doesn't make you stupid. The kind that keeps you moving when everyone around you has sat down and started humming. I'd been on my own since I was 16. Mum had gone under, not dead, just gone, behind that pleasant vacancy that the signal left in people once it done its work thoroughly. Dad had been gone before that. I left the flat in Lewisham with a bag on my back and my nan's old leather jacket on my shoulders. And I found my people the way kids like me always have, by looking for the ones who looked wrong in a world that wanted everyone to look the same. We weren't a gang, exactly. We didn't have a name, or not one we'd agreed on. Other people called us remainders, because we were what remained when the signal had taken everything it could. There were maybe 40 of us in the part of South London we moved through, ranging from 16 to somewhere in their 40s. We kept our heads down. We stole food and medicine and the occasional generator. We left the compliance officers alone when we could, because picking fights with proxies was a waste of time and energy that we could not afford. The compliance officers were another piece of the puzzle I should explain. Because none of this was simply a human government running a human atrocity, and I want you to understand that clearly. The Restoration Authority didn't build the signal. They didn't have the engineering for it. What they had was ambition and a willingness to make a deal, and at some point, I've heard estimates ranging from 15 to 20 years before the agenda went live, they made one. With what exactly, I still can't tell you with certainty. I never saw one directly. None of us did, which was part of what made them so effective. What I can tell you is what we pieced together from old broadcasts and from the few people who'd worked in the infrastructure before it was locked down. Something had made contact. Not the dramatic way, not ships over cities, quiet contact. The kind that happens in rooms where no journalists are allowed, between people who have decided that the rest of humanity doesn't need to be consulted on its own future. Whatever they were patient. They thought in spans of time that made human political cycles look like a sneeze. They had no interest in territory or resources in the conventional sense. What they seemed to want, and this is the part that still makes the cold settle in my stomach when I think about it, was stillness, a species made quiet. Whether for study or harvest, or simply because a noisy fractious humanity was an inconvenience they decided to manage, I cannot say. What I can say is that the signal was theirs. The technology was theirs, and the Restoration Authority were, for all their uniforms and their press releases and their happiness index scores, just the caretakers. The compliance officers were how they enforced it at street level. Humans, mostly, people who'd been through a different kind of conditioning, deeper than the signal, more targeted. They didn't feel nothing. They felt something narrow and specific, loyalty and the pleasure of control. They moved through the streets in pairs, wearing the gray jumpsuits and the flat effect that you learned to read as a threat from 50 meters. They weren't cruel, exactly. Cruelty implies emotion. They were simply thorough. I'd been thorough right back at them for 6 years by the time I met the old man. His name, he told me eventually, was Desmond. He didn't volunteer it for the first 2 weeks. I didn't ask, because in our world you learn not to ask for things that weren't offered. What I knew about him initially was this. He was old, he was black, he dressed like something from a different century in a long coat, the color of oxblood, and a hat that had no business still existing, and he had a voice box. Not a natural voice box. An electronic one, fitted into his throat, that translated whatever he was trying to say into a low buzzing monotone, that was somehow, despite its mechanical quality, the most expressive voice I'd heard in years. Something about the flatness of it forced you to listen to the words rather than the performance. When Desmond said something, he'd considered it first. I found him, or he found me, depending on how you want to read it, in a dead sector near Elephant and Castle. We were scavenging what used to be a Sainsbury's, which was now mostly a shell with the roof in, and a surprising quantity of tinned goods still on the shelves, because the compliance officers didn't bother with sectors that had been formally decommissioned. He was sitting on an overturned trolley, drinking from a bottle with no label, watching me with the calm attention of someone who'd already decided I wasn't a threat and was now just curious. I nearly bolted. Old instinct. "You're running hot," he said, through the buzz of his voice box. He meant the anger. He could see it on me. People who'd been fully taken by the signal couldn't read it anymore. It was too foreign, too much like a language they'd forgotten. But Desmond read it the way you read a weather forecast. "So?" I said. "So nothing," he said. "It's interesting is all. Sit down. I'm not going to report you." I didn't sit down, but I didn't leave either, and that was where it started. He'd been a doctor before, a consultant at King's College Hospital, neurological specialism, which explained why he understood the signal better than anyone I'd encountered. He'd also been one of the early whistleblowers. One of the very few who'd managed to publish anything before the infrastructure for publishing such things was quietly removed. The voice box was a consequence of that, not a medical necessity, a message. Someone had done it to him in a way designed to ensure he understood exactly why and could not forget. He'd survived for 8 years after that. He would not tell me how. He said there were things he'd done to stay alive, that he needed me to understand were not things he was and that was all he said about it. What he'd spent those 8 years doing, in between surviving, was learning, cataloging, taking apart what the signal actually was and what it could be interrupted by. He had notebooks, actual paper notebooks, kept in a waterproof sleeve inside the coat, filled with observations and calculations in handwriting so small it made your eyes cross. "I'm not going to pretend I have the solution," he told me one evening, 3 weeks in, when we'd settled into a pattern of meeting every few days in the Sainsbury's, and he'd started, carefully and incrementally, to show me the notebooks. "What I have is an understanding of the mechanism. And the mechanism has a vulnerability." I asked him what kind. "Emotional," he said, after a pause that had something wry in it. "The signal operates on a suppression model. It doesn't replace what's there, it buries it, which means what's buried is still there, and under the right conditions it surfaces." I thought about my mother, the vacancy behind her eyes that had settled in so thoroughly I'd stopped being able to find her underneath it. "What conditions?" "Extremity," he said. "Real, unmediated extremity. Pain, love. The kind of thing that comes in fast enough and hard enough that the suppression can't get ahead of it." He paused. "Or sustained, targeted stimulation. Music, for instance. The right frequencies, applied the right way, can create interference patterns in the signal. Not permanently, not even for long, but enough." I had a sound system in my bag that I'd been carrying since I was 17. I want to be clear that this was not some prophetic choice. I carried it because music was the one thing that still made me feel fully human, and I'd stolen it from a dead electronics shop, and I wasn't going to leave it behind. But in that moment, Desmond looked at it the way you'd look at a piece of equipment you'd been searching for. "I've been trying to build an amplifier," he said, "for 2 years. The components are not easy to find. What do you need?" I said. Here is what I want you to understand about the next 4 months, because I'm going to skip the details, and I need you to feel the weight of what we were doing. We were not heroes. We were two people, a scarred old doctor and a 22-year-old kid with electrical burns on 3 fingers from one very bad afternoon with salvaged wiring, building something in the basement of a decommissioned building on a street that hadn't had working streetlights in 4 years. We worked with components scrounged from dead tech and from the very few remainders we trusted enough to bring in, and there were never more than 6 of us in the room at once, because more than 6 people in a decommissioned sector was the kind of thing that flagged on whatever monitoring system the compliance officers were running. We argued constantly. Desmond was precise and methodical and deeply allergic to cutting corners. I was impatient and had a tolerance for risk that he found alarming and I found necessary. What we shared was the cold, clear anger, the kind that doesn't make you stupid. He had more information. I had more stubbornness. Between us we made something that neither of us could have made alone. The others, Priya, who had a background in electrical engineering and a laugh like a dog's bark. Marcus, who was 16 and had grown up entirely within the agenda and still somehow hadn't been touched by it. Gemma, whose sister had been taken by the signal so completely that Gemma kept a photograph in her pocket and would look at it sometimes with the focused intensity of someone trying to remind themselves of a person they once knew. Theo, who didn't know too much and was very good with wiring. 6 people, 1 basement. 1 amplifier built around my sound system speaker array that Desmond had modified in ways I only partially understood, broadcasting at frequencies he'd calculated from 8 years of notebook observations. And one question we never fully answered before we had to make the decision. We didn't know what it would do to people who'd been under the signal for 8 years. The night we chose, there was a compliance parade. That was what we called them, the monthly procession through the high streets that was officially a community celebration, and was in practice a head count and a visibility exercise. People stood on the pavements and watched, blank and smiling, while the gray jumpsuits walked past with their equipment readings and their clipboards. The parade route took them through 3 of the major intersections we'd marked on Desmond's map. We positioned the amplifier in the loading bay behind what used to be a cinema on the Old Kent Road. Theo handled the connections. Desmond checked his calculations one more time, slowly, his finger moving along the last page of the last notebook. I stood at the corner, where I could see both the loading bay and the street. I want to tell you, it was dramatic. I want to tell you there was a moment, a clear single moment when I knew it worked. What actually happened was slower than that. And stranger. The first thing I noticed was the sound. The amplifier was running below the frequency range that humans consciously hear. Mostly, what you felt was a kind of pressure change, a shift in the texture of the air around you. The people on the pavement near me didn't react to it with alarm. They reacted the way you react when you step outside and the weather is different from what you expected. A pause, a small recalibration. Then one of them cried, started crying. A woman in her 40s in a beige coat with a trolley bag beside her, standing on the pavement, waiting for a parade to pass. She didn't seem to know why. Her face did something complicated and slow, like a photograph developing. And then she put her hand over her mouth, and her shoulders shook, and she was crying with the confused abandonment of someone who hasn't cried in years and has forgotten what it feels like. She wasn't the only one, not even close. Up and down the street I could see the same thing happening, staggered, rolling outward from us. People whose faces were doing things faces weren't supposed to do anymore. Not all of them were crying. Some of them looked furious. Some of them looked terrified. One man sat down on the curb and stared at his own hands like they belonged to someone else. The compliance officers in the parade formation faltered. Their conditioning was different from the signal. More targeted, more deeply embedded, but the amplifier wasn't designed to distinguish. What I saw in their faces when it hit them was something I hadn't expected. Confusion. They were trained to manage a compliant population. They had no protocol for a population that had just abruptly and inexplicably stopped being compliant. I was already moving. Desmond had planned for this part too. We had 7 minutes before anyone could triangulate the source and get officers to our position, he estimated. 7 minutes for the amplifier to do as much as it could do. I ran the route we'd walked 100 times in our heads. Down the alley behind the old cinema, along the utility corridor to the junction box that Priya had mapped 3 weeks earlier, to the secondary broadcast point where Marcus was already waiting with the backup array. We'd built redundancy into the system. If they found one, there was another, and another after that. We'd built redundancy into everything. 8 years of the happiness agenda had taught us what happened when you didn't. I won't tell you it was a revolution. Not that night. I want to be honest with you about what 7 minutes of interrupted signal actually does to 8 years of suppression. It doesn't undo them. It cracks them. It makes a fracture line. The woman in the beige coat would wake up the next morning, and the signal would still be running, and the smooth numbness would settle back in like a tide. And she would probably not remember clearly what had happened. Only that something had moved in her that hadn't moved in a very long time. But a fracture is a fracture. Desmond had a word for what he was trying to do. He called it reminding. You couldn't free people from the outside. The signal buried what they were, but what they were was still there. Fear, the love, the anger, the loyalty, the grief, the stubbornness, the particular human refusal to stay down. All of that was still in them, waiting under the surface, pressed flat and silent. What the amplifier did was remind it that it existed. That was all. Remind. It turned out that was enough. Not because 7 minutes changed everything, but because 7 minutes repeated creates a pattern. And patterns create memory. And memory creates a kind of resistance that the signal was never built to handle. Because the signal was designed by something that thought in geological time, and thought humans were a problem of engineering, rather than a problem of will. It had smoothed the surface. It had not understood that beneath the surface the fire doesn't go out. It banks. It waits. We ran 4 more operations in the following weeks. Different locations. Different patrol routes. Always 7 minutes. Always the same rolling effect. The confused tears, the awakening faces, the compliance officers looking at their clipboards as if the numbers had stopped making sense. The 6th time, something happened that we hadn't planned for. The compliance officers didn't respond to contain us. They stood in the street, and 4 of them took off their gray jumpsuits, and 2 of them were crying. I watched that from 3 streets away, and I thought of something Desmond had said to me once, early on, when I'd asked him why he was bothering. When I'd asked, in the specific tired way of a person who has been angry for a long time, and is not sure the anger is still worth the cost, why he thought any of this could work. He'd taken a long time to answer. He'd looked out of the window of the Sainsbury's at the hot December street, and then he'd looked at me with his old eyes that had seen more than he'd ever tell me. Because they underestimated one thing, he said through the flat buzz of his voice box. They thought stillness was the same as peace. They thought if you remove the noise, you remove the self. He paused. They were wrong. The self isn't noise. It's the thing that makes the noise. And you can't take it out without taking everything. And if you take everything, you've got nothing left to rule. He tapped the notebook. They built their agenda on a misunderstanding. All we have to do is demonstrate the misunderstanding clearly enough. I thought about that, standing in the cold, and yes, by that last December it was cold again, as if the world had felt something shift and responded in kind, which I know is fanciful and I don't care. Watching those gray jumpsuits come off and fall to the ground. I told you I'm 22. I told you I've been angry for 8 years. I want to be precise about what that anger is and isn't, because I think it matters. It is not the anger of someone who wants revenge. I have had opportunities to want revenge, and I have examined myself honestly, and what I find is not the hot, hungry thing that wants to hurt someone back. What to find is something simpler and less photogenic, a refusal. A flat, clear, fundamental refusal to accept the accounting that the happiness agenda tried to do on behalf of the human race. The accounting that said we were better off without ourselves. That what needed to be managed was our interiority, our grief, our rage, our love, our inconvenient and relentless wanting. The refusal isn't noble. It's not a principle I arrived at through reasoning. It's more like a biological fact about me, the same way some people can't roll their tongues. I tried early on to be calmed. The signal worked on me, partially in waves. There were stretches of weeks in my first year alone when the edges got softer, and I felt the pleasant nothing and thought, briefly, that maybe this was fine, that maybe peace was the right word for it. And then something would catch, a song, or a particular quality of light, or the smell of my nan's jacket, which I still had, and the full electrical charge of being me would come back in a rush so overwhelming it was almost pain. And I'd know that the soft thing wasn't me, that the thing underneath it, the angry, loving, frightened, stubborn, sharp-tongued, still-here thing was me. That's what I mean when I say the fire doesn't go out. Desmond died in January. I'm going to tell you that plainly and not dress it up, because he wouldn't have wanted it dressed up. He was 67 years old and had been living rough since 59, and had a series of health problems that he'd been managing with improvised solutions for years. And one morning in January, he didn't wake up. I found him in the chair in the corner of the basement where he'd taken to sleeping, still in the oxblood coat, the last notebook open on his lap to a page of frequency calculations in his tiny, precise handwriting. I sat with him for a long time. Then I took the notebooks. I want to tell you that his death made me angrier. I want to tell you it hardened something. The truth is more complicated than that. The truth is that I sat there in the cold basement, and I felt something the signal had never fully taken and never could. The specific corrosive grief of losing someone you loved who showed you what it meant to still be here. Who'd spent 8 years staying alive against every incentive to stop, not because surviving was easy or pleasant, but because there was something unfinished. Because the misunderstanding needed to be demonstrated. I felt it fully. I let it move through me the way Desmond had told me once that grief was supposed to move. Not stopped, not managed, not smoothed. Through, and then I stood up and I kept going. The operations continued. With Priya running the calculations now, cross-referenced against the notebooks, and Marcus, 17 by then, taller than me and steadier under pressure, handling logistics. Gemma had the photograph still in her pocket. Theo was still quiet and still very good with wiring. We added people. Slowly, carefully, the way you add anything when you can't afford to get it wrong. Remainders from other sectors who'd heard something was happening, who'd come looking for the fracture line they'd felt. One night standing on a pavement, watching a parade. A former infrastructure technician named Boyd, who confirmed things about the signal's architecture that Desmond had theorized but never verified. A 14-year-old named Steph who had never known anything except the agenda and was the most frightening kind of angry, the kind with nothing to compare it to, no before, only now, and the cold understanding that now was wrong. The fracture lines accumulated. Here is what I think, and I want to be honest that this is my interpretation, not certainty. The thing they hadn't modeled for was duration. The signal was a suppression system, and suppression works when what it's suppressing doesn't have reinforcement. The problem was that every time the amplifier ran, it wasn't just waking people up briefly. It was proving to them that there was something to wake up to. That underneath the pleasant nothing, they were still there. That proof accumulated. It was a thing they remembered even through the signal's smoothing. Not clearly, not in detail, but as a feeling, the feeling of having been themselves recently. You can't unknow that you exist. The compliance officers were the first systemic crack. They were human, which meant the signal touched them, which meant the amplifier touched them too. And the specific conditioning that made them compliance officers, that narrow loyalty, that pleasure of control, turned out to be fragile under a different stimulus, which was the sight of a population beginning slowly, messily, in ways that had nothing to do with efficiency or protocol, to come back to itself. They were not all on our side. Let me not make it tidy. Some of them were beyond any frequency we could reach, gone too deep into something we couldn't name and didn't fully understand. But enough of them, enough stood in the street and took off their gray jumpsuits. The Restoration Authority responded the way bureaucracies respond to things they don't understand, with paperwork, and then with escalation, and then with a kind of performative severity that had the hollow quality of something that knows it's losing the argument. They announced new curfews. They increased patrol density. They issued a communique that described organized emotional disruption as a public health threat and promised enhanced signal maintenance. None of it worked the way they needed it to. Because what they'd discovered too late, the way the slow and patient always discover things, was that they'd been so focused on scale that they'd missed the particular. They'd managed a population and missed the person. And populations are made of persons, and persons are made of the thing that makes the noise, and that thing, as Desmond had tried to tell them, in his notebooks and his papers and his published research before they took his voice, is not removable. It simply is not removable. I'm telling you this 8 months after January. 8 months after the basement and the chair and the oxblood coat. I'm telling you from a city that is not what it was, and is not yet what it will be, that exists in the complicated, ugly, hopeful in-between, of something that has cracked and not yet reformed. There are still compliance officers on some streets. There are still sectors where the signal runs at full strength, and the faces are smooth and the smiles are pleasant, and something that used to be alive moves behind them like a memory of a memory. There is still so much to do.
But I am walking down the Old Kent Road in December, and it is cold. Genuinely, properly, bracingly cold. And the person in front of me just swore at someone in a way that is rude and human and completely real. And somewhere behind me, something that sounds like an argument is happening with full emotional investment from all parties, and I feel the cold air in my lungs and the leather jacket on my shoulders and the notebooks in my bag and the clean electric charge of still being here.
They built their agenda on a misunderstanding. The misunderstanding was us. They thought we could be made still. They thought the noise was the problem and the silence was the solution. They did not understand how could they, patient and geological and alien to everything that makes a person, that the noise is the point, that the grief and the rage and the stubbornness and the love and the refusal and the spite are not symptoms of a species that needs managing. They are the species. You can't take them out. You can't smooth them down. You can suppress them for 8 years and build your whole administrative structure on the silence. And what you will find, eventually, is a girl in a leather jacket with a sound system and a dead doctor's notebooks, and more spite in her than any compliance frequency can reach, standing on a street corner in the cold, still here, still running hot, still absolutely refusing. The fire doesn't go out. Remember that.